And I think with that, I'd like to welcome Britt up onto the stage and then
Thank you. Do I need to use the mic or just, I do, okay.
People here won't be able to hear.
Got it, okay. All right, cool. Well, thank you very much for that intro, Evan. And he'll get a little closer. Am I too short for this? Here we go. Yeah, and hi everyone. Thanks for coming out today. I'm excited to chat with you all. When I was approached about doing this, I had a few different thoughts about how to approach it, and anyway, decided to go with kind of the founder's journey story a little bit and some of the lessons I learned along the way. Hence the title here. And if anyone's a Dr. Strangelove fan, I don't know, inspired. So anyway, I guess where I'll start though is that I know some of you, or at least on LinkedIn, there seemed to be some chatter about space urban planning. So I figure, all right, I got to talk about that at least a little bit. So let me go back in here. So when I started Celestial Citizen, and this was back about 2.5 years ago, I'd like to say that this was the initial mission from the get-go. It wasn't. We evolved, we grew a lot, we figured out a lot of things we were doing wrong and sort of course corrected along the way. But looking back, I think that what we've always strived to do is really build towards this idea and this concept of sustainable space communities. There's a lot of discourse, at least within the space industry, about, okay, how do we eventually live and work in space? And the approaches to it, I think, are, unfortunately not all that innovative. And so one of the big things that I strive to do with Celestial Citizen was honestly just start a conversation about what the future of space exploration could look like. And there is a burgeoning community, I would say, of folks that are really focused on this topic and approaching it from a different perspective, both technologically, but also from a social perspective as well. And so it's nice to see, but I guess from the urban planning perspective, one of the things that always stuck with me from a professor that I really admire is that, and I'm paraphrasing here, but better planning today enables greater options tomorrow. So if we're not thinking about planning this out from, as Evan said, a very holistic approach, then I fear that we're going to make a lot of mistakes that are not easily course corrected in space. So space urban planning, I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this because I don't think that's what you all came here for. But basically, the concept of Celestial Citizen and this idea, this niche area of space urban planning was really to build on a movement that was happening with space architecture. So maybe 20, 30 years ago, there were a handful of space architects working, down the road at JPL. And now there's quite a community of space architects, some of which have found employment at commercial space companies and elsewhere. And so it was my hope in starting Celestial Citizen that we would start to include more people with urban planning backgrounds, because that seems like a missing link. And really, this was to encourage more democratic participation, civic engagement in the space industry, also facilitating a lot more transdisciplinary conversations, which are much, much needed. People are operating too much in silos. And then also just figuring out ways to integrate feedback into future designs, have iterative design processes, which people are already employing, but they're not employing those necessarily with public feedback. So really wanted to encourage and empower a much broader base of stakeholders. And a lot of this is because there's a ton of knowledge gaps when we think about actually living and working in space. So I remember, not to name names, but I remember one of the first space conferences I attended when I decided to make the shift and pivot into this industry was the Mars Society conference. And they were talking all about how this is how we're going to live and work in space. And there were just so many pieces of information that were missing that I'm not really entirely sure that people even were acknowledging at the time. Some of it they knew, they didn't know, but other pieces of it they did not. So for instance, one example is comprehensive surface studies, right? So before getting into the space industry, I worked in real estate development. And what do? You do surveys, you understand where you're building, what you're building on. And in space, we don't have that. So one of my favorite lunar geophysicists, because I think everyone should have one, He basically said that, a meter below the depth of the lunar surface is luna obscura, which I love that as a phrase. And so I don't understand how we're planning to build these permanent settlements, permanent structures on the lunar surface if we don't have that information. And that's just one example. I also have a good friend at MIT, and she's getting her PhD studying waste management on the lunar surface. I think at this point, we're all very familiar with the orbital debris problem, but maybe we're not. And if not, check out our podcast. We talk about it a lot. But the point is that not a lot of people are focused on what we do with all the waste that's going to be produced on the surface. So again, it's just starting to think about all these things. And then from a planner architect perspective, I started to think about, well, how, if we're going to be building these communities, or let's even call them bases, because sometimes when you say community, people go, whoa, that's 100 years out, right? But if we talk about bases, which are much more near term, right? How are we thinking about expansion planning for those? We don't want to get into a situation like we've seen in Antarctica, for instance. And how do you start to regulate, or do you regulate at all, land use in space, right? And that gets very complex when you look at treaties and all the legality behind it. And then I think there's also just like this big picture here. I love showing this slide to people because generally speaking, when I talk to groups, somebody's at least maybe stood in one of these cities at some point in time. And so urban planners, we like to look at things kind of from a bird's eye view in a lot of ways. And so when I look at these, I find it so fascinating to see the different patterns that emerge from all these different places. And if you actually envision yourself being, on the sidewalk, or, in the middle of a busy street, hopefully not a busy street, but, how does that feel? What are you sensing in that moment? What are the sounds you're hearing? Can you efficiently get around? Like, how do you function? How do you live and work in that space? And so when we get these images from SpaceX, right, which I always kind of chuckle because, I love it. Well, SpaceX, the thing about it is that they have created something that captures the imagination and is super inspiring, but they'll be the first to admit there's like no planning behind this, right? So it's not like they've thought through what's going to be located where. And I think that this gives a little bit of false hope to people in the industry and even outside of the industry that somehow somebody has this figured out, and we don't. And again, even little choices like this are important because you have to start thinking about, like, from those very early first buildings and structures that get produced, how people get around is going to matter. And I always show this too because, so we've got McMurdo Station, which is just like a mess. And some might even say, we're witnessing the breakdown of some civil society there at the moment. And then on the other side, we've got Barcelona, right? So it's just like, it's hard for, I think, people who are very like zeroed in on their particular area of focus within the space industry to sometimes see the impact and the importance of these decisions early on. But that's kind of the drum that I've been trying to beat for the last 2.5 years. Is like, we have to think about this now. So this is basically just a summary. I won't read all these points because I want to jump into my founder lessons, which is what I really came here to talk about. But hopefully that gives you a sense of space urban planning and what I even mean by that, because people always kind of scratch their heads when they hear it. But that's a little bit about Celestial Citizen. And of course, the way that we approached it was, okay, I realized pretty early on, I was like, maybe I'll get paid as a consultant, but like, this really isn't a company. And so where we pivoted instead was we started doing storytelling and narrative building around what was going on in the space industry through podcasts, newsletters, films, in-person workshops as well. And we had a lot of success with that. So our community now across all our social media channels stands at about 200,000 followers. So there are a lot of passionate people about these topics, and that's been amazing to see. Okay, so now I want to get into like the founder lessons, which, oh man, it's going to cut off the lesson number. Okay, that's fine. I don't think it matters. But anyway, so as I've been working on Celestial Citizen, which is my first startup, I've learned a lot of things. And the number one thing I learned is that no one is ever going to love your startup or your idea as much as you. And you might want them to. You might want to find employees that care about it just as much as you do, co-founders that will join you in this quest, investors that will just like 100% understand your vision and what you want to do. And that's just not going to happen. And so I think coming to terms with that earlier on, realizing that as you grow and as the company goes through cycles, you're going to inevitably disappoint people. You might even disappoint yourself. But you need to remember that it is incumbent upon you to really clarify your vision for people. That was something I struggled with a lot. Especially in the beginning. I feel like I held a lot of things in my own head and I didn't necessarily have the tools at the time or the ability to really communicate effectively to the people that were working for me and with me about what we needed to accomplish and do. And so that was probably my first and maybe one of my more painful lessons. And I guess I should say too in this picture, like just for context, so we, for a while, were doing a lot of media projects out of my garage. We like put up a green screen and it was very bare bones, but we did it. And like, this was a really low moment where I realized that we just spent a lot of money on something that was not going to work and not going to pan out. And it was kind of dealing with that and just generally being concerned about how much runway we had left to figure it out. And so I share that only because it's not all fun and games for sure. All right, so lesson 2, I'm gonna lose count at some point here, but anyway, the idea might be good, but the timing is bad. So at Celestial Citizen, we had a ton of ideas. We had a great team of creatives from both inside the space industry and outside the space industry. We had people who were really passionate about telling these stories, and oftentimes we had, like, honestly, too many good ideas from a storytelling perspective, but we just didn't have the bandwidth or the resources to go after all of them. So pictured here is one of those ideas that we had. It was actually a live stream show that we were working on. And I think collectively as a team, we still felt really good about what we were building and about the fact that at some point it made sense, but we rushed into the project. So we tried to get it off the ground when we should have been preserving runway. And that was a mistake. And, you know, I take ownership on that one. And, you know, we still had a lot of fun along the way. But I think it's understanding that you have to sometimes wait for the right moment in time to go after things, right? You can't just go full force, jump off a cliff, hoping something's going to catch you. Like, you have to be more thoughtful than that. So that was my second big lesson. Okay, this next slide, the lesson is that input is like salt, great for seasoning, but don't overdo it. I thought about including a picture of the organization that came to mind, and then I was like, no, I'll get into too much trouble. So I left it blank. You can use your imagination. But the point here is that ultimately you will receive as a founder so much input. You will receive so much input from people, well-meaning, sometimes not so well-meaning, but the point is that, you know, you have to be able to sift through that. You have to be able to distill it down to what works, what doesn't. And you also have to have the courage to say, that's actually not great advice from my company. And you have to be able to kind of know where that line is of kind of how much to integrate and then how much to kind of say, thank you, you know, and maybe I'll leave that one to the side. And no one talks about that in founders. So I feel like that, I don't know, or at least, I don't know, no one did to me, but this lesson I love because it's really true. You'll never regret the time that you've spent building your community. So as I said, our community really grew a lot, very organically over the last 2.5 years. And whenever I feel like I'm kind of struggling through something or at a low point, like I just read through the messages that I receive from people in our community saying like, hey, I listened to your podcast episode about, you know, including people that have disabilities in the space industry. And that was really impactful to me because of, you know, XYZ reason. And, you know, we've got other people who have just said that, you know, our short film about gender discrimination and sexual harassment in the space industry, like people would comment and say, you know, I'm just so happy that you made this. I feel really seen in my experience. And so like, I don't want to get choked up, but hearing these things, like, that's exactly why we took on all these projects, is because we wanted to have those conversations and make more people feel like they could be a part of the space industry and that they should be a part of it. And so when we have that feeling of like a really safe place in our community and these people feeling seen and heard, like that, nothing makes me prouder than that. To be honest, it's all worth it. Like I go back and do it all again for that. And the other thing too is like, just selfishly, the community also lifts me up. So like, if ever like I'm feeling kind of down and out, like there are people that have joined our community and then I'll see them at conferences or things like that. And they're always checking in, like, how are you doing? Like, is there anything I can do to support you? So the power of that and the power of like opening up and broadening your community as much as possible is so powerful, and it really pulls people through. Okay, so the next lesson is don't let people tell you what you are, but also listen to what they think you are. And by you, I mean your company. So what I mean by that is there was an investor that once told me, like, your company will be defined by who's willing to pay you for what, and that will tell you who you are. And yeah, I mean, I think that is true to an extent, but I also think that it's important to not just be guided by other people's perceptions. So it's important for you to kind of like take a step back and say, okay, so why do all these people see my company as, X, but I see it as Y? And trying to understand that disconnect, I think, is actually a pretty important conversation to have with yourself and with your team. Okay, and then I obviously didn't learn that last lesson very well, or this lesson based on the last lesson, I guess, but because I just referred to it as your company and you, but you are not your startup. Okay, so this is something that I think also first-time founders really struggle with, is because you put so much into it and it's your first time doing it. And so in a lot of ways, your identity gets wrapped up in what you're building. And that's actually like really toxic. That's a really bad thing to do for yourself, because you need to have a healthy distance from it so that you can remain somewhat objective. I don't think you can ever be objective about your own startup, but you can remain somewhat objective. So I think reminding yourself that you are a whole person, so in addition to, my company, I also, I have 4 kids, and I'm a wife and a daughter and a mother and all these things, and a friend, and I have hobbies and interests, and there's a lot more depth to a person than just what they're working on. And so you always need to remember that. That's like a very hard lesson, but very critical. This next one, don't hide who you are. So even though I'm like wearing a suit in this picture, maybe I am a little, but the point is that in this scenario right here, so this was this past spring, I was giving a talk about space urban planning at the Humans to Mars Summit in DC. Now, a couple years prior, I had created, kind of a whole like summary that I was going to propose to speak at various conferences. And I had an academic advisor at the time discourage me, saying it's not the right time. People aren't ready to hear about this. Maybe wait a little bit, maybe wait a couple years. Obviously I did wait a couple years. I regret that, because I feel like I should have just gone out and shared my ideas in the way that I was thinking about things earlier on. Like, what was the worst that was going to happen, right? I get feedback, I use that somehow to kind of get to the next step. So I think sometimes people will be well-intentioned, but maybe kind of be like, well, not now, or I would discourage you from doing this. And sometimes you just got to take the plunge, and you got to be like, space urban planning. Yeah. Like, if people aren't ready for it, okay, that's fine too. But don't be afraid to talk about the things you're passionate about and the things that you care about. And, in my case, I spent a number of years thinking about it, learning about it, and theorizing about it. And so the fact that I was scared to talk about it is, it's ridiculous. So anyway, don't hide who you are. Don't take Eminem's advice. Don't lose yourself in the moment. Because ultimately, I think when you're working on startups, right, it's really easy to go down this rabbit hole of, I have to do this to support my company, and I have to make these choices and things like that. Like, at the end of the day, you need to remember who you are. You need to remember your values. And honestly, mental health for founders is a huge thing. It's a huge topic, and I know people are talking about it more and more. But the more you're true to yourself, the more you take care of yourself, you get sleep, you get rest, be active, do what you need to do to like clear your mental headspace, and remember who you are before you started your company, the better off you'll be. So yeah, don't take Eminem's advice. Do take Elsa's advice though. Let it go. Okay. So I think like one of the things with Celestial Citizen is, again, going back to a lot of these prior lessons, like because I was so wrapped up in feeling like this is my identity, this is my brand, this is how people came to know me in the industry I work in, I felt like I couldn't let go of it. Like I couldn't objectively say, okay, like, maybe this has run its course. And, with Celestial Citizen, again, was really proud of how we grew it and where it's at. But I also had the realization, at the beginning of the year where I was like, this is not going to scale. And there's no pivot that's going to make something this like broad and comprehensive into a workable business concept. And so I think I had to come to terms with the fact that it was maybe time to let it go and to start thinking about the next thing. And as soon as I allowed myself to be okay with that and say, yeah, okay, like let's envision the scary thing, like what comes next, right? I have no idea. But when I gave myself that permission to think about that in that headspace, and then I also, had conversations with friends and mentors, and somebody gave me this really great piece of advice, which is like, if you weren't worried about working on something that you think other people are going to accept, what would you work on? Like if you could just pick anything. And when I started thinking about it from that perspective, it was actually really clear cut, like what the next thing was. But again, I had to be okay with letting things go. I had to let something go in order to move forward. And so I guess like, I don't know, the surprise twist of this is that I'm actually transitioning out of my role at Celestial Citizen, and as of a couple months ago, I'm now co-founder on Haven, where we are developing what I believe is going to be the precursor to whatever happens with living and working in space, which is mobile habitats for the lunar surface and transport and logistics services. So, I think the big lesson, the big takeaway here is, you just have to keep evolving and not being afraid to kind of take the plunge. And honestly, it's amazing what opens up and what kind of comes your way when you do that. In my case, it was finding an amazing co-founder to work on this with, and a team of technical advisors that are super passionate. And honestly, it's been a great experience, and we're all just really enthusiastic to work on this together. And so I never would have gotten there if I hadn't been okay with stepping back and letting others kind of run with my first startup, and saying that's okay. I'm ready for the next thing. So anyway, I hope you found these lessons to be helpful, useful, and if not, maybe mildly entertaining. But thank you for your time.
Hi again. Britt, thank you so much. This was amazing.
Thank you.
Stay up here because we're going to do Q&A next. And so the format of Q&A, first of all, please make a question, not a comment. You can make comments after. You can come up and meet Britt, one-on-one and make a comment there. But with that, I think I'll turn it over to the audience here. Who has a question? Aaron.
Hey, Britt, thank you so much for coming and sharing your story, especially as a founder and lessons learned. It's amazing to hear from you. I'm curious, I spent about 26 years in tech myself and done a lot of self-reflecting. I'm taking a year off sabbatical, if you will, to do some of my own self-discovery. Mm-hmm. And one of the things I find very, very important for me is these kind of real life meetups in person. You talked about the importance of community building and never regretting that. I love being part of communities like this. And so I'm curious, can you tell me, for Celestial Citizen, how much of your community building was primarily online? It seems like you did a good majority of it during COVID and you're kind of locked in. And did that open up into real life meetups? And are there still any kind of real life meetups related to Celestial Citizen that you're part of? And even though you're moving on, can I ask a little follow-up question? Are you still involved with Celestial Citizen yourself?
Yeah, great question. Oh, yeah, I just wanted to, yeah. So yeah, I mean, great questions. So you're absolutely right. We built Celestial Citizen during the pandemic era, which was really interesting. And you know, when I launched it, really it started out as our MVP, if you will, was like our first podcast. And so I was pretty shocked by how many people were listening to the podcast with like no marketing budget, very grassroots, just like really kind of word of mouth throughout the space industry, but then also like people outside the space industry finding us, which was pretty cool. And then really, I would say when things started to grow, like the first big boost we got was like, I don't know, was anyone else here on Clubhouse back in those days? Like, yeah, okay. So, I mean, right, like, and especially the space community on Clubhouse was, I mean, it was intense. I mean, there were, again, I'm not going to name names. There were some folks here in Pasadena who I swear were like on Clubhouse 10 hours a day. And it was amazing because they were sharing these great insights. So you would be in the room, virtual room with like all these different experts. So really early on, and at that point we were like a team of like 3 people at Celestial Citizen, but like we were like, we got to get on Clubhouse, we got to host all these different talks. And the interesting thing about that is actually one of our rooms. So we had a lot of technical rooms and rooms about like social issues in space, but then one of the rooms was also about women and gender minorities in the space industry. Those conversations are actually what gave way and led to like the inspiration behind our short film. And our short film Take Up Space. It's free. You can watch it on YouTube if you're interested. But the thing is that like all of these virtual things built our community little by little, you know, over time. And so then it was people were finding us now through multiple different channels and having conversations with us either on Clubhouse or in comments sections or things like that. And we would host Instagram lives and we would connect with people that way. And, you know, we would do YouTube live streams and things like that, webinars. So a lot of it was virtual. And then what was really exciting is then as like the pandemic, you know, started to end, we then moved into doing like in-person workshops. And those are like, I don't know, maybe it's the urban planner in me, but those are just like so powerful to have people sitting around a room, brainstorming together, you know, like mapping out like, you know, answers to different questions and tough questions about the future of space. So we'd love to do more of that kind of stuff. My role with Celestial Citizen at this point, I think is like, you know, I'm still involved, still helping like, you know, guide it at a high level, and still being involved in, you know, some of the content kind of, you know, instead of being like full-time host, you know, maybe like guest host, things like that. But I'm definitely still involved, and you can still listen to our podcasts. You can, we have a newsletter, just came out this morning, comes out every 2 weeks. And so it's more just about handing off, you know, now that it's kind of like more of a well-oiled machine, handing that off to folks and acknowledging that right now is not the time for growth. And so it's kind of like, we know what we can do well at this point, and we're going to keep doing that and keep doing it hopefully well. And just kind of like trusting that the people that I've brought in are more than capable to continue, you know, guiding the ship, so to speak. And so that's freed me up to now, you know, work on this new thing. So.
Thank you. Next question.
Amazing talk.
Thank you.
And I want to ask something a little bit more about the kind of first part. So you mentioned that when you were first kind of on the journey of Celestial Citizen, you know, quickly realized that it made more sense to focus on the media side and less on, you know, consulting. I'm just curious, you know, long-term view, like if I were a 20-year-old space urban planner, which I'm none of those things, what do you think would be the inflection point before that kind of business becomes actually feasible? Yeah,
That's a great question. And actually, I have had a lot of urban planners reach out to me being like, when's the right time? So that's a tough one to answer, because ultimately, I think in terms of like inflection points, here's a couple of things that I think are holding us back from that. for one, I don't know how familiar you all are with like Blue Origin, but they have, I believe, 3 space architects, the entire company. So space architecture, like I said, growing as a field, you can now go to many places, get a master's in space architecture. That's fantastic. But in terms of actual like employable opportunities, there are obviously like space architects that are employed by JPL and NASA. But even those positions are still relatively few and far between. And some of that is because there is a trend within the space industry to want to work with name brand architecture firms and starchitects. I'm like personally not a big fan of that model because I think that ultimately I'm much more interested in how we create a collective vision, right? Like we have all of these different like, you know, generative AI tools and things like that. And yet we're like so afraid to let any sort of public knowledge base guide what we do and what we build and design for in space, which to me is kind of ludicrous because these are the people that are going to be living there. So I don't necessarily want my base to be designed by one person who doesn't understand how I live or anybody else does for that matter. So, and there's many cases like in architecture of this being, you know, the starchitect model does not work. So I think it's a little bit that theme that exists. And, you know, even I noticed like when I was talking to folks at NASA, when I was a graduate student working on some research, and other academics, it was like, okay, well, why don't you just create the plan for the first lunar? And I was like, no, you're missing the point. It's not like nobody cares what I think the first 100 people should do. It's about it's about the process and bringing people together and then like pulling in all of this complex data and creating something out of that. And so I think it's changing the mindset there. And then I think there's another couple of things here, which is also like geopolitically right now. I'm not sure if it's like the best time to be talking about bases and settlements on the moon, like to be fair. So I think there's a fair bit of that coming into play. And honestly, like we are seeing just more and more of a movement towards like militarization of space. And so the idea of creating like an international community where everyone gets along is like maybe a little far off right now. So what I've decided is like the more bite-sized way to approach this for now is to get people to understand more and more that it's that planning mindset and toolkit that can be used in any complex mission planning and should be used. So what I hope we can do is like, and there's a really interesting history of how like back after the Apollo era and there were like the budget cuts, a lot of NASA engineers actually went into the urban planning industry, which is fascinating to me. It didn't go so well, like spoiler alert, because you had a lot of engineers trying to engineer social problems, which was a disaster. But so what I would like to see is like the reverse happen, where we start to see the value in what urban planners bring to the table and start to bring them over into positions at NASA and at other commercial space companies. And that can happen slowly at first and then really build up over time. But I think having those people in the room is going to be really helpful. To get to any sort of like comprehensive plan. I mean, there's been some calls for like broad infrastructure plans, but in terms of actually kind of integrating infrastructure with human factors and all of that, like I don't know if people are ready for that just yet. So I'm still waiting to see what's going to change the narrative personally on that as well. Great question though.
So I'm going to ask a question, and then I'll let me know, pat me on the shoulder if there's the next one. But to follow up to your question, Chris, can you think of I mean, what's your, I guess, mental model? Can you give us an example of like, okay, well, city X, whatever city that is, you know, did this really, really well organically, and you know, using that frameworks that you're talking about. You know, obviously, terrestrially, the risk is much lower. You know, in space, we're not designed, human beings are not designed biologically to live in space. But can you think of or can you give us one or two examples of how that happened really well here on Earth, so that we can at least try to say, oh, humankind has done something like this before, and we need to do this times 10 for space.
So that's like a really loaded, tough question because like also, so a lot of my time spent in urban planning was like critical theory of planning. And so when you do that for long enough, you're like, wow, there's like no city that's really done it right. All cities and places are going to have their issues. And I think one of the ways that I approach this is like sometimes, okay, I'll try to organize my thoughts here. Sometimes it's really hard to see a clear path forward because living on this planet, it's like you get so overwhelmed with all the problems there are, right? And all the issues that we have to deal with. And actually, a good friend of mine just published a really interesting piece, Ben Kelly. He's a former CEO of the launch company and co-founder or founder of it. And basically he was writing about the fact that like we all think in space, it's going to be this like magical, like, oh, we get to start over. So it's going to be so much better. But his point is like, we're going to inevitably bring all the baggage we don't figure out and all the problems that we don't figure out how to solve here to space with us. And that's honestly a lot of what we talk about on the podcast as well. So when you're looking at actual like city examples or models of that, I mean, one, I'm also cognizant of the fact that like a lot of that is like a value-based judgment, right? So it's like we're all going to be really biased about what we personally like in terms of aesthetics or style, based on like the environments that we're used to, right? And what we like and don't like about them. And so that's a really tricky one. I'd say like the biggest thing that worries me about space is actually that we're going to borrow too heavily from examples that we have here on Earth. So for instance, there's a lot, there's like, if you look at even like, some of like Brasilia or things like that, like as an example of how people took this like almost like blank slate kind of planning mentality and like nothing is a blank slate. And I think that's like the big takeaway message is so we need to make sure that we're not trying to create these like utopian cities, which inevitably become dystopian. And there's oh man, I'm blanking on his name right now, but there's an urban planner that wrote about this really eloquently when he said that you want your cities and your communities to have a fair amount of disorder and chaos in them, because that's life, like that's humanity. And so you're not ever going to be able to, nor do you want to completely design away all of the things that make us humans, right? Otherwise you're designing for, I don't know, robots. But the thing is that being able to have that mindset in space, and then also acknowledging that like based on differences in gravity, right? Like the way that we design here on Earth doesn't make sense like in space, right? So we need to start thinking about it from that perspective, which is really hard to do when we haven't experienced that environment ourselves. But in terms of city examples, I mean, I put some up here, which, are, I mean, you might be able to tell I'm like kind of a fan of a grid pattern. But beyond that, I always kind of hesitate to point to anything because that's just my preferences. And I think what we need to look at is kind of more like the collective preference of what works for as many people as possible. And maybe it's a hybrid model as well. And I think we have a lot of interesting tools at this time to help us with that. I alluded to that before, but it's also really important that we don't miss like the very important social piece of this, because we all like the bias issues within AI like are just going to be massively exacerbated. So it's like trying to figure out how to balance all of these tools that we have, all of these skill sets and expertise that we have. We can look at historic models of cities, but I wouldn't want to lean like too heavily on that either, because really we're designing for a future that could and should be something totally different.
Next question.
So you showed that lovely map of all the other maps of all these cities. And most of the ugliest, junkiest, terriblest designed ones were the oldest cities in civilization. And as a result of, here was a city and here's what it looks like 2,000 years later. So if we go to the moon or we go to Mars and we build those cities and we design for them now, how do we also design for them 1,000 years from now so that you don't have what we might consider maybe the ugliness of London?
Well, those are fighting words.
How do you do that?
So that's really interesting. So that's actually part of the brainstorming process that led me to create Haven. Because ultimately, I don't know, and maybe it's like kind of like a little bit of like chickening out about the answer here, but the thing I kept going back to is like, we don't know enough to build anything of permanence. And I've actually given talks to like, there's a space philosophy group within like AIAA, and I give a talk about how like we have as humans, like it's human nature to want like stability and permanence. We need to move away from that because that holds us back from being more resilient and adaptable over time. And so I think it like is kind of a fundamental, like your philosophy on this, but in space, like I'm actually very concerned about the fact that we are proposing going up, and I'm not going to say they're permanent because for that exact reason, I think they're like temporary and stationary, which is different. It's not very efficient or innovative, right? Because you're absolutely right. Like we have this like commitment, and I'm going to get myself into trouble with like, you know, building heritage people, but like we have this obsession with protecting the things that we build. And I feel like that's really going to hold us back. And it's also usually very one-sided. So if you look at even, you know, like these heritage sites and things like that, like they're very, like there's a lot of value judgments that go into like what's worthy of being protected and what's not. We're seeing that already. Oh, I'm going to get myself into trouble with some space people today, but like, you know, protecting the boot prints and things like that, right? Like, just because this is the first direction that somebody walked towards this crater, are we going to protect that? Like where do we draw the line of what we're protecting? And then like by virtue of just it being the first stuff that gets built up in space, are we going to protect that? Because that was like the very beginning of this new era of human civilization. Personally, like I don't love the idea of that. I think that really holds us back. So the idea behind Haven is that it's a commitment towards mobility. It's creating a vehicle that like we're trying to extend the useful life of it as much as possible. And we're having a mind towards reuse and repurposing it. And then kind of saying, okay, like if you believe that it's important, and maybe you don't, like you don't have to, but like maybe if you believe that part of human progress is also exploration, I think mobility is fundamental to exploration. And I think adaptability is as well. And so I've actually, and this is weird because I'm like a space urban planner, but I'm actually more concerned with building and designing early bases, communities, things like that, groups of vehicles that all move around together in such a way that we're actually keeping our options open and that we're flexible and we're not permanent. Because I want us all to keep moving forward. I don't want us to get stuck in the next thing. And I think that's what will happen if we do that. So ultimately, you're right. Like, I don't think we should be worried about that. I think we should be worried about exploring more and taking care of each other more as humans and growing as a society together.
So I have a follow-up question to that. I can't remember the fellow's name, but there's this notion in systems design that complex systems are best when you create a very simple framework and then you evolve the small pieces in this sort of grander framework that's simple. How far do you think you are on creating that simple framework, either at Celestial Citizen or at Haven?
So I'm really biased, but I view Haven as kind of being like one of the first steps. So part of the problem, and I you know, tried to touch on this a little bit with Celestial Citizen, is that like part of the problem is that I was just approaching it from such a high level and it was too complex and there were too many pieces. And it was like hard to explain to people. It was hard to get, you know, it just wasn't working. And so when I took a step back and I was like, okay, well, how do we prevent disaster? And how do we provide people with something useful that we think is like leapfrogging us to the next point? So, right. So like, even if you look at it now, people are really focused on like back in the Apollo era, we had the LRV, super cool little moon buggy. Like we all love it. It facilitated a lot of great science, but it also had a walk back limit of like less than 8 kilometers. So, you know, wasn't really able to let us like explore a ton, but that was fine because it was Apollo and we were just like, it was amazing that we were even there in the first place. And now we still see that a lot of people are spending time focusing on like LTV, like lunar terrain vehicles that are sort of like an incremental step on that. But what we felt was that humans needed something that was actually going to allow them to comprehensively explore the lunar surface. So whereas like LTVs are saying their range is 20 kilometers, our range is 5,000. And so being able to expand that exploration potential is huge for the science we're going to collect, for the ability to understand the surface, where to go. If we do want to put up anything temporary and stationary, where do we put it? That's all going to be really valuable. And it allows us to, at some point, you know, in the nearer term, get humans on the surface as well. Because if we're waiting to do that until we have a bunch of stationary habitats and structures, we're going to be waiting a much longer time. Here's the other thing is if we focus on a mobile unit, it's not too difficult to then in later phases of development, convert for the Martian environment as well. There's obviously a lot of differences that you have to account for, but fundamentally, many of the same subcomponents and systems you're working on actually work in that mobile unit, right? So I bring this up because I think I didn't even realize it at the time, but Haven really was like the first step in this broader plan of, you know, ultimately what I think could or might happen, you know, on the lunar surface and then eventually Mars. And it's really about starting a foundational technology that enables things. And I'm sure I'm not going to live long enough to see all these things come together. But hey, if I can spend my life like working on like this like first technology, I'm fine with that. And again, that was part of the growing process of like I had to accept that the bigger vision wasn't necessarily the thing to work on today.
Cool. More questions? Okay.
Thank you so much for the talk. You talked a little bit about the challenge of dealing with silos. Can you speak a little bit more about like what you do to enable this transdisciplinary approach to addressing complexity?
Yeah. So I think, and this is one that's ongoing, to be fair. So I try to, and over the last couple of years, just in building this, I feel like I've built out and extended my network quite a bit. And I think also having a media and a storytelling company also allows people to interact with you in a way that is kind of like on their own terms and at their own pace. So like one of the things I'm really proud of is the fact that we have out of our listeners and readers and all that kind of stuff, I mean, it's folks at NASA in senior level positions, it's, you know, senior level executives at other companies, and it's everyday people. So the important thing about this, and it's also people like, you know, my sister who never really even thought about space up until I started this. And now she's like, oh, like, I'm going to read this and see what's going on there. And so I think the important thing is like trying to reach people that are in positions of power where they can influence change. In addition to kind of, you know, creating this like enthusiasm and curiosity amongst the public as well is really key. So I feel like we're slowly chipping away at that, like through a podcast episode or through like an episode, you know, a YouTube video or through like our film, we're starting to change minds like little by little. And that's how we've kind of done it from a grassroots approach. Now, I've also approached folks at NASA and said like, hey, can we do a workshop with experts from your community and members of the public in, you know, XYZ community? And there hasn't been interest in doing that just yet, but, you know, maybe at some point soon. And I think the more that we start to do those things, the more people are going to understand that diverse perspectives and viewpoints are really important. I'm personally a big fan of things like I believe outsiders see things that insiders cannot. And so that's really key. Now, within my own organization, within Celestial Citizen, I actually made a conscious effort to hire people who had space experience and then people who had no space experience. Because what I wanted to do is, especially when you're talking about communication and media, I wanted to have people who were creatives, like they worked in the entertainment industry around here. But I was like, if you can start to read through this, digest it, and then share it with people, they're going to be able to understand it that much better because, you know, they're just like you. And I think too much of the space industry is like, we're talking to each other. So that was like a real effort that we made. And even now with Haven, right? Like I was very strategic about, so right now it's myself and my co-founder, and then we have 3 technical advisors. Each technical advisor has a very different skill set. So we wanted to basically have a lot of unique perspectives. And I think that's just a good way to do business. Unfortunately, that tends not to be how people operate, especially within aerospace.